NFL teams are calling the Chicago Bears about Robert Quinn. The real question is, the team listening?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Blue Nile. This Mother's Day, give mom something she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On podcast listeners get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. Use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout. On the show today, the Robert Quinn trade rumors don't stop and, in fact, get fueled with Ian Rappaport from NFL Network reporting that there's some interest in there, that potentially this could still maybe at least be a possibility on the table here. We'll check in on what a potential Robert Quinn trade might look like, what the value would be, what the financial situation would be for both the Bears and the team receiving Robert Quinn, and whether or not that would really be worth it for the two sides. We'll also kind of look at it in the bigger picture look of this Bears team overhaul process that Ryan Poles isn't calling a rebuild. We'll hear from the general manager about how he's sort of approaching this, and also how it plays into the larger conversation about building around Justin Fields through this retooling process, we'll say. But it starts with the Robert Quinn question, the Robert Quinn potential of a trade here. It's something that I think has sort of been a thought through most of this season, but then, or most of the offseason, I should say. But then when they traded Khalil Mack first, that sort of calmed it down a bit to say, okay, if Mack's gone, then they're probably going to keep Robert Quinn, right? That's sort of been the assumption we've operated on from here. But now, just a day removed from the NFL draft, all of a sudden, things are picking back up. NFL Network insider Ian Rappaport tweeted on Tuesday, there was a quote tweet of a quote that Robert Quinn had given at a press conference. He was named one of the Bears' Brian Piccolo Award winners, and Robert Quinn's quote was, quote, "I didn't expect to go anywhere or want to go anywhere, but again, this is a crazy business." So Quinn basically kind of saying, like, not that he thought he was going to be traded, but he, I guess, wouldn't have been surprised had he been traded up to this point. And so Ian Rappaport from NFL Network quote tweeted it and said, "Interesting, Robert Quinn was in Chicago today meeting the new staff and spending time with Bears coach Matt Eberflus. But teams are sniffing around on him for a possible trade, one of several veteran names being discussed." And so all of a sudden you wonder how fluid those discussions are, or how real or how close those discussions are. I mean, those discussions are real, they've happened, but more so like how serious, I guess, is the word I'm looking for here, because Robert Quinn is coming off of an 18.5 sack season, the best season of his career, a huge return to form and a breakout here for the Chicago Bears. And of course, without Khalil Mack, he would be in an even bigger role in this Bears defense entering this season. But the Bears also in this sort of wholesale type mode here of moving on from veteran players and kind of getting the new regime's players in this scheme. There's no doubt that Quinn would be able to fit this 4-3 defensive end position that he's played for most of his career. It's a question of how valuable he is to the organization versus to potentially another organization. And that's really where it gets tricky here, because, obviously he would be the Bears' best pass rusher. Without him, they have Al-Qadim Muhammad at one spot and likely Trevis Gibson or Mario Edwards or even Jeremiah Tauchu potentially at the other spot. It is a deep position, one of the Bears' deeper positions, that edge rusher spot. But, how much are you going to get for him? And is what you get for him going to be an ample return on what you're losing, right? And that was the question with Khalil Mack, too. Was he worth giving up for just a second-round pick? There's some big debates and arguments about that. But then with Quinn, if Mack is getting only a second, you're setting the bar from there, dropping off quite a bit because of the financial aspect of this mostly, but then also Quinn has had some down years and he's in his 30s. And also, he is a little bit on the more expensive side. When you look at his salary cap situation from our friends at overthecap.com, this upcoming season, he would cost the Bears currently on the team just over $17 million as a cap hit this current season. If the Bears trade him before June 1st, which is a specific date on the NFL calendar where the contract situation changes, if they traded him before June 1st, aka like during the draft or this week or whatever, the Bears would still owe just over $12.5 million in dead salary cap space. They would still pay Robert Quinn $12.5 million or $12.7 million this year for him to not be on the team. And as a result, they would save just under $4.5 million in cap savings from that Robert Quinn trade. But then whatever team would inherit him would owe him about $13 million this year. Essentially the difference in each of the remaining years. So about 13 this year, about 14 the following year, and about 13 more in 2024, just with no real guaranteed money left on the deal. The Bears would have to pay out the remaining of the guaranteed money. That would be the dead money. But the new team would just have to pay his base salary, which at that point, they could release him at pretty much any juncture and clear that cap space for them and not be locked into him long term. But it is, if you're trading for him, you're trading for him to play him, right? You're going to trade a draft pick for him, presumably a decent draft pick, the Bears would hope, to play him. And so you wouldn't be looking to cut him. But again, he's 32 and he's going to cost you $13 million this season. There's only 17 teams that have $13 million in cap space right now. And of course, those teams also need cap space to sign their draft picks and potentially other free agents down the line here. So it becomes a smaller pool. I mean, I think there are 4 teams that have $20 million or more in cap space. If you want to think of a team that would have room to absorb Quinn and then also still maybe, have money for other things, it's the Panthers, the Browns, the Texans, and the Dolphins. So really, I think the Bears aren't going to get anything better than probably a day 3 draft pick at this point for Robert Quinn. They could hope and try and get a 3rd round pick, but even that seems like a lot given what the trade market is right now. And when you look back at Robert Quinn's career, he's actually been traded twice up to this point. He was traded once for a 4th round pick and once, I believe, for a 6th round pick in sort of like back-to-back years. Those weren't coming off of 18 sack seasons, but he was also 5 years younger then. He wasn't 32, and he was on a cheaper contract at that time. So it's like, well, if he was only worth a 4th then, now he costs more and is older, but is coming off a better year, you're not going to get much more than that 4th round pick type compensation. So is that worth it to the Bears to get another 4th round pick? You do free up $4 more million of cap space right now and a bunch more in the future, but you could also just cut him in the future and save a lot of that salary cap space too. So we'll see how the Bears want to approach it, but it's definitely part of this same retooling process that Ryan Poles isn't using the word rebuild to describe what he's doing with this organization. We'll kind of check in on that process and hear from the GM on what his philosophy is next on Locked On Bears. Mother's Day is right around the corner, and our friends at BlueNile.com are here to help you find the perfect gift for mom this season. They have fine jewelry options for every mom, whether she prefers a statement piece or everyday subtle elegance. You can shop high-quality classic diamond earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, or gemstone pendant necklaces for every price range. Blue Nile is great because even if you're having trouble, figuring out exactly what it is you want, they have jewelry experts on hand 24/7, available via phone or chat to help you find that memorable gift that fits your budget. It's something enduring, something special that she can hold on to for the rest of her life. And of course, Blue Nile is always going to take care of you with guaranteed service and repair for life. Their diamond price guarantee, you can compare a competitor's diamond against one of theirs, and in most cases, they can meet or beat that price as well. 100% satisfaction guarantee, guaranteed free shipping and returns. If it's not perfect, no problem. Blue Nile will take care of you. This Mother's Day, give mom something she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners will get $50 off of $500 purchases. That's a podcast exclusive, only good through Mother's Day. Use our promo code LOCKEDON. That's promo code LOCKEDON. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in a discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever peace. Go to BlueNile.com today. Chicago Bears are trying to find the right pieces for their organization here. And it's been at times frustrating, I think, for Bears fans, right? Seeing talented players that you've sort of grown to know and love go out the window, and the replacements haven't necessarily been, household names or even, big free agent talents or big trade requests, good trade acquisitions there, right? It has been, I think, maybe underwhelming for Bears fans kind of going through this offseason process. I think all of us on the outside have been using the word rebuild pretty regularly. It kind of feels like a lot of what they're doing, right? They're getting rid of some players and bringing in a lot of replacements, a lot of turnover on this roster, and a lot of roster spots still open. They only have 60 or so guys under. They added a couple more, so probably closer to 65 guys under contract right now. It's a 90-man training camp roster that you're going to bring, so that's 25 more players, and they only have 6 draft picks to go through here, right? So there's still going to be players brought in here, and it's a lot of turnover overall. And we got to hear, it's kind of the first time we got to hear from Ryan Poles real directly since the start of free agency. We haven't really heard a ton from him about a lot of the moves along the way, and he's a little bit cautious about using that word rebuild. It's a little bit of semantics, but he kind of has his own way of describing this team building process with a pretty good analogy.
Since you got here, you traded Khalil Mack. You let some veterans leave without re-signing them. You added some players on very limited contracts.
Yep.
Are you rebuilding, or is there a different word you use?
Yeah, no, the rebuild thing's super sensitive. No, we're constructing a very good football team. Regardless of how you use whatever term that is, we just continue to add talent and young talent, older talent, whatever it takes to make the best team possible. Late night with the wife, you're watching TV, you get the home network where, there's some rooms that are good. You might have to redo some countertops over here, some fresh paint over there. Some rooms are good. You don't need to touch them. So that's kind of the thought process there. That's not a rebuild either.
It's a fixer-upper.
Yeah.
If you have any good names for whatever you want to call this Bears version of an HGTV show, like Ryan Poles was referencing there, by all means, I'm open to clever and funny suggestions as to what we would call this Bears HGTV show of them turning over the roster. Like they used, somebody snuck in the word fixer-upper at the end that he sort of kind of agreed with, but not a rebuild was sort of it's a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I don't think he really cares that much about what you call it, right? I mean, he kind of was saying that the term rebuild carries some weight to it or carries some kind of connotation, and that he's not super keen on associating with. But again, if you have any better ideas for the Bears HGTV show, let us know on Twitter at Locked On Bears or in the YouTube comments or the Locked On Bears Facebook group. I'd love to hear if you can come up with a good idea for what you would call this Bears TV show. Because there are, to his point, there are some rooms in this Bears house, if we're continuing the analogy, that didn't really need to be, uprooted and redone all that much. I mean, they've obviously the running back position, they released Tariq Cohen, but otherwise, Darrington Evans, that room was pretty well set at the top of at the top of the depth chart. Didn't need to do a ton there. They haven't really done much at quarterback, of course, because Justin Fields is in place and Trevor Siemian's the backup that comes in, but Andy Dalton was a free agent anyway. It's not really rebuilding that position, and they haven't done a ton overall at the offensive tackle position until Julian Davenport comes in. But even then, they're still kind of rolling with the same 2 starters as of right now. The safety position hasn't been particularly overhauled at this point. We still have Roquan Smith at that linebacker spot. You still currently have Robert Quinn and Travis Gibson at that edge rusher spot. It hasn't been complete tear down and build up across the board. But I do think it's a little bit semantic. It's very much semantics, and it's a little bit disingenuous to make it not seem like a rebuild. Because, of course, there's never going to be an off season where you rebuild every position, right? That's just not how the NFL works. So when Poles tries to make it, it's more of a HGTV show because you're not completely tearing down the house and building it back up again. Well, you never actually completely tear down an NFL team. There's never been an offseason where a team replaces all 22 starters. At least as far as I know, I've never seen an offseason where a team replaces every player on the roster, every starter on the roster, and doesn't keep any of the holdovers or almost none of the holdovers. The Bears have done about as much turnover, it would seem anecdotally, like as much turnover as any team would do in what we would consider a rebuilding off season, right? That seems to be a more or less accurate way to describe what they've done. I mean, you've got a bunch of brand new wide receivers. You have at least 2 new starters on the offensive line. Really, Lucas Patrick is the only one that's really guaranteed in there right now, but your right guard spot's still to be determined there. You got some new backup tight ends. You got some new defensive linemen across the board there at each position. Some new guys brought in, a couple of new linebackers, new cornerbacks, a new safety. I mean, and of course, a new punter still to be determined there. It's been a lot of different spots of a lot of different turnover. And like that's whether Ryan Poles wants to call it that or not, that's what rebuilding in the NFL looks like. Maybe that's not what rebuilding a house looks like, but that's what rebuilding in the NFL looks like. Because like the Bears, if we're going to continue the house analogy, like the Bears are trying to build the foundation right now, right? That's why they bring in a lot of these young guys and are trying to develop them and see that they're trying to figure out who's going to be part of this foundation for the future, right? That's sort of how we think about this team building process. And what's more like house rebuilding than starting with the foundation, right? That's the definition of rebuilding a house is tearing it down to the foundation, redoing the foundation, and then building it up from there. Yes, there's parts of this roster that are sort of the rooms that you're not touching, but you still got to get to the foundation underneath those rooms. And so like the analogy just doesn't quite fully hold up there if you're trying to pretend it's not a rebuild. I don't care. I don't care that much about the semantics. I just think it could be disingenuous if you pretend like it's not the same type of rebuild many organizations go through in that way. Whatever you want to call it, let's not pretend that it's not stripping the team down to the foundation and pretending like most of the structure is in place, because it's not just like a light little touch up to what the team has already done, but very much more the fixer-upper type of situation where it did kind of go down to the studs and really trying to figure out what's going to be part of your structure, literally moving forward here. So all of it is to say that this rebuild is still a work in progress here, and it's been interesting to see sort of how this has shaped around Justin Fields and some of those discussions about building up around the quarterback and putting him in the best position to be successful. And Poles addressed some of that in a way that I think is, makes some fair points, but also I think makes some false equivalencies. We'll kind of touch in on how this rebuilding process affects the young quarterback next on Locked On Bears. Our friends that make the world's best tasting protein bars have just unveiled a new product. They're Built granola bars. So you can get your protein-packed treat with that granola crunch in there too. I'm so excited to try them. They got a couple different flavors that I'm really excited to do. The Built granola bars, like all their other Built Bar products, are soft and easy to chew and covered in 100% real chocolate, but still low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It's a little bit less of like, the granola bars, I imagine, are going to be a little bit less candy bar-like and more granola bar-like than compared to their regular Built bars, but they're still going to be sweet, delicious treats that satisfy your sweet tooth and are still good for you. It's an unreal combination of nutrition and flavor that you can't find anywhere else in any other protein bar product, and you can't find granola bars that are going to have as much protein as Built Bar granola bars and still well tasting this good. Head on over to their website today and see all the different Built Bar products they have to get your protein and your sweet tooth satisfied. When you check out, use our promo code LOCKED15 and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. It's been the easiest criticism of Ryan Poles this offseason has been the perceived lack of building around Justin Fields in a noticeable, proven way that you can feel super confident about, right? We all kind of wanted Ryan Poles to hit this offseason and get a great offensive line and some really good receivers to go with what you already have with David Montgomery and I guess Cole Kmet to have all this infrastructure in place around Justin Fields so he can be the best Justin Fields he can be. And Poles has sort of pushed back on that in the past and did a little bit more so just yesterday in his press conference about how there's more to team building than just the offense, and you can't neglect the defense just to purely build around the quarterback. And it's also fair that you don't want to get too necessarily caught up in any one aspect of it, but I think there's still some room to push back a little bit on the way Ryan Poles has gone about it so far, understanding that he did have limitations here too as to what exactly he could do around Justin Fields. Here's what he said.
You balance, obviously, bringing in these young players on short-term deals, but also trying to develop Justin Fields. How do you strike that balance of making sure that Justin has enough with him on offense while also with respect to what you're doing with the rest of the roster?
Yeah. I think it's important. I think anytime you just improve the team overall, you're helping all of the players out. And that can look different. I mean, you could say, well, he needs receivers, but he needs blocking too. And he also needs balance in terms of running the ball efficiently and getting that done up front. And then you can do some play action pass stuff. You can do different things. So it all touches turnovers, maybe returner to flip the field to score more points. So it's all connected, and that's really why the mindset is to get the best players on this team as possible. If I get too lopsided, be like, I got to do this specific thing, I think that's where you lead into big mistakes.
I think it's a little bit of a false equivalency there from Ryan Poles in the sense that, like, he's not wrong in that you have to, like, build the whole team around the quarterback, and that adding at other spots on the roster that are not, like, directly impacting the quarterback can still have an impact on the quarterback and aid in that process for him. But I don't think it's fair to say, or I don't think it's accurate to say that, like, getting more turnovers, for like he mentioned there, or having a better pass rush is equally as important to the quarterback's development as wide receiver and offensive line, right? I mean, you could have the best defense in the world, but your quarterback isn't going to be able to properly develop if he's constantly under pressure, being hit and sacked, constantly having to throw the ball too soon, and doesn't have receivers that are able to get open and catch the ball when he throws it to them. To his point, like, yes, you also do need the running game, right? And the play action off of that. I mean, he's not wrong that those things are important, but the question is sort of like, are you doing enough at the positions and things that are, like, more directly closer to the quarterback? And I think it seems pretty clear that, like, if you're judging what helps Justin Fields the most, offensive line and wide receiver are going to be significantly helping Justin Fields more than cornerback, linebacker, defense, or like you said, like kick returner, he mentioned there too, field position. Like, those will help the team win football games potentially, but, like, specifically to Justin Fields' development, those are not as direct of an impact as a wide receivers and offensive linemen and those pieces that are directly interacting with the quarterback on a snap-to-snap basis. Now, where I defend Ryan Poles in this is that, like, it's hard to look at, like, what exactly he should have done completely differently, right? You can find some little things here and there, but it's like the thought is like, oh, he should have done more to add more wide receivers and offensive linemen, which I agree. But my follow-up question is, with what resources, right? The Bears don't have that much cap space. And if they hadn't traded, the Khalil Mack and moved on from some of these other players and the June 1st cuts of Tariq Cohen and Danny Trevathan, right? If they hadn't bled some of this talent to create some more cap space immediately, like, then they had even less to work with to build around Justin Fields. So, like, yes, you could have taken some of the money he spent on defensive linemen and applied more of that to wide receiver and the offensive line, right? You can find a few $1 million here and there, but it's not like it was ever an option for Ryan Poles to trade for, Tyreek Hill or Devontae Adams, or to sign, one of the top wide receivers in free agency. Like, it just doesn't seem like that was financially in the cards based on what the Bears had in cap space and what he inherited from Ryan Pace, right? He could have isolated some assets in other positions and a little bit more of an emphasis on the offensive line and receiver. And I wish he probably would have, right? I mean, I do think he could have spent perhaps a little bit less at some of these other spots. Not that he spent a lot at any spot. That's the real challenge here, right? It's not like he spent $15 million on a linebacker and $10 million on a cornerback, and you're saying, why didn't you spend that money at wide receiver? It's like he spent like $5-ish million on the defensive line, and he spent $5-ish million at wide receiver, and you could have done $3 on the defensive line and 8 or 7 at wide receiver. I mean, right, you could move a couple million here and there and cut down on a couple of other positions to better invest in the offensive line and wide receiver. And I think that's where I would draw the line at, like, that's a fair criticism. I think they probably should have spent a little less on some of those non-quarterback direct positions and a little more on some of the offensive line wide receiver spots. But it's not like there was just all this money out there to sign all the best players or trade for all the best players, and you don't have a first-round pick. So you got 2 second-round picks. It's an opportunity to get better players more directly impacting Justin Fields, but it's not that easy. It's not easy to build a great team around a young quarterback when you have limited assets to do so. So I think, again, it's a little disingenuous to say that, well, building around the defense helps Justin Fields quite a bit when building closer to him would help even more, but at the same time, there's only so much Ryan Poles had the power to do this offseason, and he might still do more with the potential trade of Robert Quinn, maybe get another draft pick to help, a little bit more salary cap space to sign another free agent wide receiver or another offensive lineman after the draft, or whenever the Robert Quinn trade might happen, or if it happens at all, or if they keep him, then they have a better pass rusher to build around Fields. So, pick your poison there when it comes to building this Bears team around Justin Fields. Not rebuilding, according to Ryan Poles, but just a retooling and a fixing up of a house on HGTV. So that's kind of where this roster is looking at entering this 2022 NFL draft. We'll be breaking down some of the Bears draft plans and philosophy for you on tomorrow's podcast. We heard from Ryan Poles about where they see some positional value in this draft, how they seem to value the trade market here, looking to potentially add some picks, and also maybe what they're thinking at wide receiver in particular in terms of strategy for team building there. So I hope you'll tune back into the Locked On Bears podcast and tune in every day for more of your daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. Just a heads up, on draft day, the Locked On Podcast Network is hosting live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft from our studios in Dallas with pick-by-pick analysis from all of our local team experts, including myself and our draft gurus. So tune in all 3 days as our draft team guides you through every pick and every trade in real time. It all starts on Thursday at 6 o'clock Central Time, available on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel and on the Odyssey app. I'll be chiming in for the Bears picks or any trades they make in that second round, at the very least, and probably into the third round through day 2 and maybe day 3. I'm not sure exactly what the full plan is there, but we'll be live breaking it all down for you. And then the Locked On Bears podcast will be here afterward to break down the Bears picks and everything else in a little bit more of a longer Bears-focused form. So I hope you'll keep tuning in, and I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it a little bit easier for you to bear down.